We're back with some more Alder Lake. This time we're doing DDR4 versus DDR5 testing. This, along with the Windows 10 and 11 testing, was one of the most requested follow-ups from you all. And if you have additional follow-up requests for testing we can do on Alder Lake, leave them in the comment section below. We're going to keep going through them and burning through all the new architecture and technology that there is to explore with Intel's new CPUs. So D4 and D5, that's what we're looking at today. DDR5 is brand new. DDR4 has been around a while, but as always, with a switchover period, there's a little bit of a latency before you start seeing major uplifts in performance. There is, however, one test in this entire suite we've done that has a massive difference in the results, and that's one of the 7-zip compression tests. We also have a couple of game results where there's a bigger difference, but overall, the two are pretty comparable. Let's get started with a DDR4 versus DDR5 benchmark. Before that, this video is brought to you by Be Quiet and the Silent Base 802 case. The Silent Base 802 got high accolades in our review for its high build quality and its versatility in both silence-focused and airflow-focused builds. The 802 comes with swappable mesh panels or noise-damped panels, so you have options for either approach. The Silent Base 802 case is able to fit larger builds as well without being overbearing, and it stands out for its mechanics quality and assembly quality. Learn more about Be Quiet's new case at the link in the description below. As we get into this, a couple of very important things. First of all, DDR4 and DDR5 are not a like-for-like comparison. That's the point of this piece. They will not be like-for-like. They cannot be like-for-like. So that's why we're doing this benchmarking, just to make it really clear. You can't set things like the timings to be equivalent, at least not with blowing them way out to something extremely inflated on DDR4. The frequencies are going to be different, and that's because the memory is different. So this is a memory benchmark in effect. Additionally, to just briefly answer a question that we saw a couple of times of why did you all and other reviewers test Intel DDR5 isn't that unfair to AMD? A couple of things. One, no, and we'll talk about that. And two, it's because DDR5 boards are the first ones that anyone had access to. We bought a separate DDR4 board. We're going to talk about that board today as well. It's an MSI one that we grabbed on Amazon for a couple $100. It wasn't particularly cheap, but it wasn't as expensive as some of the other D4 boards out there. As for the question, is that unfair? Well, one, as you'll see in the results today in this benchmark, DDR4 versus 5 testing for the review really wouldn't have changed or shaped our opinion any differently, except maybe in 7-zip. But overall, the scope of the conclusion would have been the same for Intel. Our opinion for Intel's performance would not have changed because the differences aren't that big. And secondly, it is actually fair to use a new technology that is enabled on a new platform that another one doesn't have. That's the point of new technologies. So it was a little weird to see that question. It'd be similar to saying, isn't it unfair to use PCIe Gen 4 on AMD and because Intel doesn't have it yet? Or similar to saying, isn't it unfair to run AMD with all of its cores enabled because Intel doesn't have that many cores? That is a defining feature and a defining difference in the product, and therefore is valid to test against the competitor. And so yes, DDR5 is in fact a valid comparison. Now, there is a lot of interesting data to be seen with DDR4, and it is valid to test as well, but you don't have to constrain the platforms all the same memory type if one of them supports a newer memory, because again, that is a core difference. And that does come down to the CPU as well. It's not just a memory difference. So while yes, you control a platform to the extent possible to eliminate variables elsewhere, like the GPU, the motherboard, the drives, things of that nature, memory is something that is closely related to the CPU, and the IMC, the integrated memory controller in the CPU, is a key feature of any CPU, especially a new architecture that has new DDR technology support. So anyway, we've got both sets of data now, and DDR4 has one really interesting advantage for Intel right now that DDR5 doesn't have, which is that it's cheaper and abundant. You can get DDR4 lots of places, especially used online, and you may likely already have some DDR4. So this is a great comparison to have requested because it allows us to see if you want to buy Intel Alder Lake, but you don't want to spend on D5 or you can't find it anywhere, then what performance can you expect by keeping DDR4, pulling it forward from an older platform, planting it in a new one, and basically just buying a new motherboard to go with it? It feels a little bit bad to buy an older technology and a new motherboard, But there is a balancing act where we could see a benefit for buying that board, especially if it's a bit cheaper anyway, and transplanting DDR4 to keep the overall system cost down, or just if there's an availability issue. So lots of good reasons to use D4 or D5. Now, before we get into the charts, there is information on testing methodology. It's very important. It talks about the kits of memory we used, the motherboard we used, the level of pain in the ass the motherboard might or might not be, and some other key factors for memory testing in this benchmark. People generally find that boring and they just want to see charts so they can spam them online. So we're going to do the charts first. We'll put the methodology piece right after the charts. If you care about how the testing data was accumulated, you're interested in it, or you're going to post numbers from our benchmarks here online later, please watch the methodology section after the charts so that you can actually understand how the testing was done. But for people who want to see the data first, let's get started with the data. Hitman 3 had one of the biggest differences that we observed out of any test performed in this set of data, except for GTA 5 and 7-zip. 7-zip is extremely interesting because it was insane. Anyway, with Hitman 3, don't expect to see this everywhere. We're just putting the most interesting one for gaming up front. As a reference, Hitman 3 has also shown us the biggest impact in our pre-built gaming PC tests in the past, particularly relating to how many channels are being used and the spec of the RAM, so we expected to see a difference here. In Hitman 3, the DDR5 test platform, looking at the chart now, ran at 203 FPS average. The lows were 86, 1%, and 53.1%. The DDR4 results ran at 190 FPS average, with lows the same and within run-to-run variance. That allows the DDR5 test a lead of 6.8%, which is significant, but is also uncommon. We don't see many results like this. GTA 5 is the opposite of this in one sense, which is that DDR4 wins here, but it also yielded a larger gain than most of the other games and applications tested. In this scenario, we observed DDR5 producing the best results with a 7.1% advantage over the DDR5 kit. That's when tested at 1080p. GTA 5 is one of the oldest games in our CPU test suite, so CSGO would be up there with it in age, but the rest of them are much newer. We'll look at CSGO shortly as well, but for now, just remember that the older title did better with DDR4 with our specific settings. Remember also that this will change based on the kit and the timings, obviously. It's not as simple as just DDR4, DDR5 is better than the other. It does actually depend on what you're using. For what it's worth, we saw the same scaling at 1440p with GTA 5 when tested with these same kits, so let's move along. Red Dead Redemption 2 is another Rockstar Rage title, but it's much newer as an implementation of Rage. This game is fairly GPU bound with our highest performing CPUs, so it's not a surprise then that there was little scaling going from DDR4 to DDR5. The difference was a 1.5% advantage for D5 here. The 0.1% low may have improved somewhat, but 0.1% lows are highly variable by their nature, especially in this game, where they're within range of each other if you look at the markers on the bars. For people who are wondering how our reviews might have differed with D4 instead of D5, this is the answer. Most of the games wouldn't show a huge difference and would likely not affect the conclusions made anyway, assuming at least you're on a similar spec to us. And when it comes to producing reviews, these are the kits we would have used, so this would be your alternative for the results. Counter-Strike Go preferred our DDR4 kit. The numerical difference in FPS may seem large at a glance at 377 to 367 FPS average, but the DDR4 kit's advantage works out as a relative difference of just 3.4% versus the D5 kit. Lows were proportional, and still it's noteworthy to see a 3.4% advantage given that the advantage does go to the older platform. And this isn't impossible either. Just because it's older doesn't make it automatically worse. Consider a timing like case latency, for example, for the DDR4 kit, or really any of the latencies we fine-tuned with the D4 kit. The D4 kit we use is 3200, so it's running at 1600 megahertz. That's 1.6 billion cycles per second. It has a case latency of 14 cycles, and all the other primaries are 14 as well, and 34. So that's 8.75 nanoseconds for a case alone. The DDR5 5200 kit runs at 2600 megahertz, or 2.6 billion cycles per second, and has a case latency of 38 cycles, so 14.6 nanoseconds. That's higher than that of the DDR4 kit, which again was 8.75. There are more factors at play, obviously, as illustrated by the DDR5 kit winning in two of our previous tests, but that's just an example of why a higher frequency kit isn't automatically better. We saw the scaling transfer to 1440p as well, with no real difference between the two. F1 2021 swung back in DDR5's favor with a 2.3% advantage at 1080p, plotting 328 FPS average for D5 and 320 FPS average for DDR4. Lows are about the same so far, with the exception of Hitman 3. It doesn't seem like DDR5 is the main factor behind Alder Lake's good performance in our benchmarks. It's doing pretty well with DDR4 as well, and it really wouldn't have affected how we view the CPUs. So where we're saying it's good with DDR5, it's also good with DDR4, and it remains competitive with AMD in basically the same ways. At 1440p, the results aren't different enough to be worth speaking of. We're becoming more bound by the GPU here than memory anyway. Far Cry 6 showed similar behavior to Counter-Strike with a 2.2% advantage for the DDR4 kit at 1080p. This is one of the relatively few applications where we saw a DDR4 advantage, although it's mostly a technical advantage. The lows are similar for both sets of data. At 1440p, the gap shrinks to 1.5% due to GPU limits, but it is repeatable and consistent as a gap, and it remains in favor of DDR4. Cyberpunk 2077 had a 3.5% uplift, with DDR5 at 177 FPS average to 171 on DDR4. Overall, the results are still in the DDR5 kit's favor, but Hitman 3 is the only benchmark that, again, has shown more than a couple percent difference other than GTA 5 for DDR4. Rainbow Six is another DDR5 win, this time by 1.6% at 1080p. That's not particularly noteworthy. It certainly isn't noticeable in the game, especially at these frame rates. It's not particularly interesting, but it's repeatable and it's a difference, so there's that. We did notice for the second time in this test that DDR4 results here plotted better lows. It's possible that this comes down to manual timings that we've been using for our DDR4 kit, whereas we haven't really gone through the fine-tuning of our DDR5 kits yet. We don't fully understand them to the same capacity we do with DDR4 because we've been using those for years now. It could also be that this is related to a motherboard difference, maybe something with how the board is behaving with B clock or something, but we'd have to look into it more closely. Ultimately, the gaps across the entire suite aren't large enough to warrant a massive investigation, and we only have so much time, and we'd really rather spend it on other things that we're more interested in studying with Alder Lake right now than chasing down what this small gap is. Time to get into the production benchmarks. 7-zip went two ways. We'll start with decompression. In this test, the two data sets scored about the same at 150K MIPS with DDR4 and about 148K MIPS with DDR5. That amounts to a difference of 0.8%, so that's variance. The compression result is far more interesting. It scaled from 97K MIPS, or again millions of instructions per second, up to 125K MIPS with DDR5. That's a 29% increase. That's staggering. But it's one that we saw reproduced elsewhere as well, like in Annotext reporting. So we're confident that this result is good, and we did retest it just out of good faith and good testing, and it produced the same. The DDR5 kit has some advantages that may not be leveraged in most of our CPU tests. So if we try to explain why this is happening, our best explanation we can come up with is this. Our two-stick kit uses 4 32-bit memory channels for DDR5, while the 4-stick DDR4 kit that we standardly use in our testing uses 2 64-bit memory channels, and that's on this and most other desktop platforms, so that may contribute to this difference. There's certainly other applications that would highlight the difference, but we didn't design our test suite for memory. We designed it for benchmarking CPUs. One could definitely argue that memory is an extension of the CPU to the extent that the IMC is part of the CPU, but you'd still have to build a specialized suite to really bring out those differences. Our next production test is Cinebench R23. We didn't expect this to be strongly affected by memory as it's mostly a thread-based workload. The DDR5 kit was only 1% ahead in multi-threaded performance, and given that the motherboard change and the normal deviation run-to-run of Cinebench can contribute to this easily, we're calling it variance. Consider this confirmation that we set the power limits correctly on the MSI board to match our original ASUS test bench. Like Cinebench, Blender is a tile-based rendering benchmark that's largely core-bound. It wasn't affected by the memory swap. Moving on to the Premier benchmark, the DDR5 kit produced a 4.5% increase over the DDR4 kit score when in the extended test with 8K footage. In the standard portion of the benchmark, not individually broken out here, it was still ahead, but only by 2.3%. The memory advantage was more noticeable under certain conditions like 8K in Adobe Premiere testing. In contrast, the Photoshop benchmark showed no appreciable difference between the kits, so we'll move on. Building Chromium for Windows with the ClaneCL compiler took 48.6 minutes with D5. That's 4.1% faster than the DDR4 kit for this one. This and the Puget Premiere benchmark are the two tests we run that have the highest capacity of memory needed, and both of them favored DDR5. So with all of the charts out of the way, time to talk about the MSI BIOS and that board we bought. Now for the most part, we've done our Intel CPU testing over the past couple of years on high-end ASUS ROG boards. One reason is that we've found their BIOS UI consistently easier to work with, and another is that ASUS makes it relatively easy to apply Intel's stock or officially Intel's recommended guidance for power, turbo boost, etc. The MSI Pro Z690A DDR4 board that we bought is the most we've interacted with an MSI or Intel combo outside of extreme overclocking in the recent years, and the interface hasn't really changed much since the Z270 era. The option for loading defaults is still under Settings, Save, and Exit, for example. There's no simple way, for example, to load the Intel default guidance on this motherboard, which is more of a problem for us as reviewers than it is for a customer, where you don't necessarily care as much about controlling the settings, but it is definitely a pain in the ass and follows MSI's general ethos with designing motherboards. The 12900K defaults to all-core rather than per-core turbo, and it maxes out the power limits unless the cooler type is changed from, quote, water cooler, which is maxed limits, to boxed cooler, which is Intel limits. Sort of a bizarre way of representing the option, but okay, you do you, MSI. We used Gear 1 for testing on the MSI board, as we always do with DDR4 CPU testing. All of our Alder Lake DDR5 testing was done in Gear 2 for reasons explained in our 12900K review. This was the default when we applied the primary XMP on the Corsair kit that we used for testing, and we may move to Gear 1 with tighter timings for DDR5 when it comes time to refresh our CPU benchmarks. And part of that comes down to us learning how to work with DDR5, Alder Lake, and overclocking it or tuning the timings. As we move forward, get more comfortable with working with DDR5, we'll probably tune that further. That brings up another point though. Again, this isn't a like for like between D4 and D5 by design. Our DDR4 test memory is a G.Skill Trident Z 4x8GB kit of DDR4 3200CL14. We have selectively tuned the timings for that as well to 14-14-14, for example, and some others like FAW and TCTL, so forth. That kit is a great balance of speed, capacity, and universal compatibility. That's the important part. It works well on Zen 1, for the most part, all the way up to Alder Lake, and it also goes back a few years in older Intel generations. That's why we've been using it so long. DDR5, we're using Corsair Vengeance DDR5 5200CL38. It's a 2x16GB kit, so that is a difference as well. And it was one of 3 sets of DDR5 memory that we've had available or had access to at the time of testing. We can do potentially more D4 versus 5 testing, more like for like as we accumulate more kits in the future. Obviously, DDR5 has higher performance on the whole, but how much higher depends on the settings of each kit, as Der Bauer recently demonstrated. And that's the important point to just remember, is that DDR4 and DDR5 is not like the spec. That's not the thing we're comparing in whole. It's all the timings and frequencies and everything else within the memory that gets compared as well. And that should recap the methodology and the charts. The biggest difference we saw, just concluding, was in 7-zip, specifically with compression, not with decompression, interestingly. It was 29% uplift for DDR5. That's massive, but that was not something we could reproduce anywhere else. Now, if you made a set of memory-specific benchmarks, probably you could reproduce this result. We explained why we think this happens in the 7-zip section. It has to do with memory channels, if you want to learn more about why, what our hypothesis is for what that difference came from. But for gaming, there's not a huge difference. In Hitman 3, there was a definitely noteworthy one of 7% or so, and GTA 5, it was the same. Hitman 3 was benefited by DDR5 by that percentage, and GTA 5, which is a very old title, was benefited by DDR4 at that percentage. CSGO also showed a little bit of a benefit by the DDR4 kit that we had. A couple of things though, again, if we used different kits of DDR4 or DDR5, it's possible that these results shuffle. So ultimately, we're only presenting data for the 2 kits and settings that we used, not for just DDR4 versus 5 in general, although the title of the video will list that way because I can't really fit DDR4 3200, 14, 14, 14, 34, TFAW, whatever it is we use, and TCTL, and REFI, and everything else that we tune. I can't really fit that in the titles. It's going to say DDR4 versus 5 testing. And overall, that is what we're looking at. But just remember that as you buy higher-end kits, one or the other, obviously you'll see a benefit one or the other. Overall, though, with decent kits for both, at least as a starting point for D5, there's not a huge difference except for in a few applications. So should you buy one or the other? It comes down to mostly a point of opinion, less so than performance. If you're doing compression absolutely try to get DDR5. There's a huge difference there. If you do a lot of that, you know that's in your workload, you should try to get that platform. But overall, the primary reasoning for choosing one versus the other would come down to the basics of if you're looking at this from a perspective of dragging forward as many components as you can out of an older system to save money or to reuse something you've got laying around, which is an excellent goal to have in general, then buying a DDR4 board may make sense. And you're not necessarily losing a lot in at least gaming and many of these other applications, although not all of them. You do lose something. You gain a couple, but not as much. You're not necessarily losing a lot, though, if it's not your workload to do things like compression, video editing, things like that. And you could potentially save some money on the memory purchase or accelerate your ability to get a system up and running if DDR5 isn't available at the time you're building your system. So that's a reason to go with DDR4. Now, it does feel a little bit bad to buy a motherboard that has DDR4 slots on it when DDR5 is supported by the same CPU. If you don't feel bad about that, great. And if you don't benefit from DDR5, great. Keep using your D4. You can save some money. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. As far as future upgrade support, well, Intel sockets don't tend to have a very particularly long life, but if you buy something like a 12600K or something like that today, or 124 when it comes out, then perhaps in 4 years, like with people who are upgrading from a 4690K to a 4790K, you might see a meaningful benefit to do a drop-in replacement. And at that time, you might also want to replace to DDR5, to a modern kit that's more available at the time. So that's how you build your computers, where you try to do drop-in replacements later, maybe plan for that, go with DDR5 early so you've got that room to do an upgrade, especially because it's a brand new technology, so it will get cheaper and more available. But if you're just trying to get a system up and running for gaming and D5 is too expensive, not available, you don't care about drop-in socket replacements later, you kind of build the system, use it, and then you replace it with an entirely new system in the future, then either one's okay. DDR4 obviously is a bit more available, but pretty simple in that regard. It comes down to if you care about the differences from more of a method of how you build or do things, meaning do you want the latest technology for potential future proofing, which is sometimes a fool's errand, but not always with memory, or do you just not care? So that's it for this one. Differences aren't massive in most cases. And of course, yes, DDR5 is a valid technology to test with. Just like if AMD came out with DDR6 tomorrow, we would test with that against Intel's DDR5. So that should answer it all for you. Thanks for watching. As always, leave your comments below with what other aspects of Alder Lake you'd like to see us investigate or explore next. Overclocking is on our list. I'm hoping to get bearded hardware up here sometime so we can do some liquid nitrogen with it. But thanks for watching. As always, go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly. You can grab things like our toolkits, which are on back order now after almost a year of being out of stock. So if you want to guarantee you get one, grab it on the store via back order, or you go to patreon.com/gamersnexus for some extra posts. And subscribe for more. As always, thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.